Good evening to all of you. Thank you for that very warm reception. I am Adrian DeWind. As chairman of the Natural Resources Defense Council, I am here to welcome you to this year's James Marshall Lecture. Our speaker, as you know, will be the eminent scientist Carl Sagan, who will be introduced to you in a minute or two by Congressman Worth of Colorado. This year, NRDC reaches its 15th birthday. We are a non-profit organization dedicated to protection of our natural resources and of the living environment, and in our 15 years we've accumulated almost 50,000 members across the country. We are very pleased tonight to have with us Mr. James Marshall, for whom this series of lectures is named. He was a founder of NRDC and continues as one of our trustees to be a source of major policy input to the organization. Jim, I would like it if you would stand up and let this audience recognize you. And now I would like to have Congressman Tim Worth from the 2nd District of Colorado introduce our speaker. She has been a powerful and effective voice in the Congress for environmental protection and has led the effort to have the nuclear winter problem fully considered and its major policy implications for nuclear weaponry. And Congressman Worth, please.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you all for coming, and most importantly, thank you for your support of NRDC, which does such good work on behalf of the environment and conservation and helps us so much in the Congress. Albert Einstein observed that the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. In making this famous statement, Einstein certainly was paying special heed to the war planners of both the U.S. and the USSR. Both countries have continued to expand their arsenals and devise war-fighting plans as if a nuclear exchange were an extension of conventional warfare. How else do we explain the casual manner in which so many phenomena related to nuclear warfare, blast destruction, radiation poisoning, ozone depletion, and all the rest, have been termed irrelevant to the way in which we construct our warfighting plans and develop our strategic nuclear arsenals? With their work on nuclear winter, Dr. Sagan and his colleagues have challenged the war planners' complacency about the impact of nuclear war. The scientific evidence continues to accumulate, confirming that a nuclear exchange, even a limited one, is likely to trigger a global climatic catastrophe that could mean the end of the human species on Earth. Nuclear winter is a powerful, powerful idea, one capable of breaking into the spiral of armaments and making people, as Einstein urged, change their thinking. And to further the power of this idea, Congressman Leach and I on the House side, and Senators Warren and Cohen on the other side of the Hill, offered the legislative language requiring the Defense Department to report to the Congress on the full implications of nuclear winter. And what's been done? Instead of reporting as required, and instead of reevaluating their plans as will be necessary, they are instead only seeking to discredit the scientific foundation of nuclear winter. At the center of this activity stands our speaker, Carl Sagan. His scientific efforts and public appearances have been responsible for placing nuclear winter at the center of the strategic nuclear policy debate. We all thank him for investing his prominence and reputation in helping to bring this important theory to the country and to the world's attention. And that reputation, as you know, is considerable. He is the David Duncan Professor of Astronomy and Space Sciences and Director of the Laboratory for Planetary Studies at Cornell University. He has been deeply involved with the American space program, including the Mariner, Viking, and Voyager expeditions to the planets, for which he received the NASA Medal for exceptional scientific achievement. He has been awarded the NASA Medal as well for distinguished public service, the International Astronomics Prize, the John F. Kennedy Astronautics Award of the American Astronautical Society, and the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Dragons of Eden. In addition, Dr. Sagan has been the author, co-author, or editor of over a dozen books, the most popular being Cosmos, which accompanied his immensely popular public television series of the same name. In sum, Dr. Sagan is obviously a person that we should all be listening to, whose views on scientific topics such as nuclear winter must be closely heeded. That's precisely why we're all here tonight. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. Carl Sagan.
Thank you, Representative Worth, for your very generous introduction, and thank you all for your equally generous welcome. Let me begin by saying I wish I was talking to you about some other topic. This is a dreary and painful issue, and let me apologize at the outset for having to present disquieting facts and to be critical of some policy positions and statements of our government. I wish I didn't feel it was necessary to be critical, and I wish it wasn't true that the United States and the Soviet Union have together contrived a doomsday machine which threatens everybody on the planet. Unfortunately, this does seem to be true. And so, if it is true, it seems to me there is no more important topic. Whatever your aspirations and hopes and fears and expectations for your children and grandchildren might be, anything that involves the future is fundamentally threatened by the danger of nuclear war. And therefore, it seems to me that there is no more important issue, that no doctrine, no belief system, no economic system, no social order, no religious faith can be more important than the issue of safeguarding the human species. When it first became clear that nuclear winter was a possibility, that there was a hitherto unglimpsed possible catastrophic climatic consequence of nuclear war, when we did our first work, the so-called TAPS group, Turco, Toon, Ackerman, Pollock, and myself, it seemed to me that there were policy implications. It was immediately clear that there were, that the implications were at variance with the conventional political wisdom, the strategic posture that the United States and the Soviet Union together worked out over the last 40 years. And so, because I was certainly a novice on any issue of strategy, I thought it was important to get the advice of wiser heads, and with the help of some friends, we put together a small, very high-level meeting here in Washington in the Capitol that involved former high officials of previous administrations. Averell Harriman was there, for example, and also, how shall I say, senior practitioners of dark arts. And I presented the scientific background, our findings that even a remarkably small nuclear war involving less than 1% of the strategic arsenals seemed enough under some circumstances to trigger this global catastrophe. And then I went through some of the policy implications, which seemed to me obvious. And then it was time for this distinguished audience to respond. There were a number of interesting responses, but one in particular. One senior person said, "Look, if you think that the mere prospect of the end of the world is enough to change thinking in Washington and Moscow, you clearly have not spent much time in those places. Let me just remind you about the character of the arsenals. There are some 55,000 nuclear weapons on the planet today, most of which, almost all of which, are more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 55,000 nuclear weapons. Of those, about 18,000 are strategic weapons, weapons designed to go from the homeland of one adversary to the homeland of the other. For example, a single U.S. strategic nuclear submarine has enough warheads, independently targeted, to destroy between 160 and 192 Soviet cities. One U.S. strategic submarine. Why isn't that enough to deter the Soviet Union? Put another way, if the certain destruction of 150 to 200 Soviet cities was in the hands of the United States if the Soviet Union behaved too outrageously, and if that threat was inadequate, what threat would be adequate? 2 submarines? 3 submarines? But 3 submarines can destroy more cities than there are in the Soviet Union. But we have 30 strategic submarines. We have vast arsenals in silo-borne MIRVed missiles, in bombers of the Strategic Air Command, in cruise missiles of various types, in intermediate range ballistic missiles, and the Soviet Union has a slightly different mix of arsenals, but a comparable destructive capability. Even this description indicates how vastly in excess the arsenals are for any conceivable deterrent use. When we look at the climatic consequences, I maintain that statement is even more true. The prompt effects of nuclear war are, of course, well known. I will not spend much time on them at all. Everyone, certainly in the United States and the Soviet Union, knows very well about the prompt radiation, the blast, the immediate fallout, the plumes of radioactivity that go downwind of the targets, and the death and destruction from such prompt effects is, of course, chilling and would represent by itself, just the prompt effects, an unparalleled disaster in the whole history of humans on Earth. Now, what I would like to do is to show you some slides on the general principle that this is a subject easier to understand by looking at it than by hearing it. This is a 1 megaton nuclear explosion over Manhattan Island. There are some nearby subsidiary explosions. It is common targeting practice to target at least 2 warheads per significant target. Here is ground zero, and here in miles from the center of Manhattan is a scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, going in both directions. There is an immense fireball, which is essentially the physics of the center of the sun, brought briefly to the surface of the Earth, and a shock wave which rushes along the ground and destroys even steel and concrete reinforced buildings. This is the famous mushroom cloud. The shock wave has reached this distance. Here you can see a set of major conflagrations that have been established out to more than 10 miles from ground zero. You can also see that none of the skyscrapers on the New York skyline are left standing from a single megaton or multi-megaton explosion. Next slide shows these individual fires coalescing, and then what happens in a case like this, although let me stress that nuclear winter does not depend on this merging of fires, there is a great upward draft, like the draft in your fireplace. The consequences for the inhabitants of this region I leave to your imagination. The next slide shows what it's like afterwards. The ground is, of course, leveled. Everybody in here is almost certainly dead, and there is a dark pall of sooty smoke from the burning of the city, which rises into the atmosphere and is carried to considerable altitudes, it now appears. Now imagine such a cloud of smoke over 10,000 targets, because that's the rough number that a full exchange represents. Here, for example, is a view of the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt here, Israel up there. And here a number of small cities and oil refineries and petrochemical facilities have been targeted in this scenario. And over each of them there is a dark cloud of sooty smoke blown to the right, that is, blown to the east by prevailing westerly winds, and this is true all over the northern mid-latitude zone. These smoky clouds rise, coalesce, and begin to cover a very large area. The next slide changes our point of view. We are now in space, looking down on the North Pole. Every one of these dots that you see within the Earth is the flash of a nuclear explosion. The artist, as patient as he was, could only draw 100 or so, but you must imagine that over the course of a few hours, there are some 10,000 such flashes. Next slide shows us the same view, and you can see there's still a few flashes occurring from, I don't know, nuclear submarine commanders who hadn't been informed that the war was over, something like that. And you can see that the plumes of smoke have now coalesced so that there is a significant dark cloud that covers the entire northern mid-latitude target zone that embraces the United States and the Soviet Union. The next slide puts us in an equatorial plane, looking down on the Earth. Here's South America, and you can see that the entire northern hemisphere has been socked in, and there are streamers, plumes of clouds that are already rushing across the equator. And the next slide shows us something like a couple of months after the war is over, in which the northern hemisphere is still underneath this cloud, and it has reached over a significant distance into the southern hemisphere as well. This sort of picture is what is called nuclear winter. If you are outside and you can't see down to the ground, if you're on the surface looking up, you can't see out into space. And that means that the kinds of thicknesses of smoke produced on the average over the northern mid-latitudes is so great that the sunlight is significantly diminished. In the TAPS group's baseline nuclear war, a 5,000 megaton nuclear war, that's between a third and a half of the strategic arsenals, the average diminution of sunlight was down to about 1%, something like 10 days after the war. 1% of the average sunlight at noon when you step outside after the war is over. That is pretty dark. It's not too dark to see by. It is, however, too dark for many plants to photosynthesize by. Now, much more serious than the dark for organisms like us who live on the land, is the cold. The temperature drops are significant. In our calculations, they were certainly more than 10 centigrade degrees for a war in July, which would mean that substantial parts of the planet — I'll show you some recent three-dimensional computer calculations in a moment — get below the freezing point of water in midsummer. A single day below freezing is adequate to destroy the Japanese rice crop. An average temperature 3 degrees below normal is enough to destroy all wheat and barley in Canada. A 1 degree global temperature decline, that's an average temperature decline, was sufficient in the year 1816 to produce in North America what is called the year without a summer. I'm giving you these numbers to indicate that temperature drops of only a few degrees can be absolutely catastrophic. We're talking about temperature drops significantly greater than that. Maybe no more than 10 degrees, but maybe 20 or 30 degrees. And I think you will see, if you just consider the nature of the web of life on this planet, the enormous interdependency, that if you start turning off the lights and lowering the temperatures, you are going to rip the delicate fabric that interconnects all life on Earth. It is clear that the destruction of agriculture when you lower the temperatures and turn off the lights would be enormous, and it might very well be for significantly more than one growing season. A typical city in the United States has enough food stored in it for 1 week for the people who live there. And the food distribution systems, transportation, communication, sanitary services, medical facilities, civil services would collapse from the prompt effects of nuclear war, and nuclear winter would mop up the survivors. In addition to the cold and the dark, there are a number of other aspects. You burn a modern city, in those sooty clouds of smoke, there are toxic materials. You burn 10,000 targets, and you're going to produce a lot of pyrotoxins. In addition, there are effects like ultraviolet light. After the fine particles have fallen out, the high-yield nuclear explosions, it turns out, have partially destroyed the ozonosphere. The ultraviolet light comes from the sun, comes in with enhanced intensity, and that ultraviolet light is especially dangerous for life because the key molecule of life, the nucleic acids, absorbs in that ultraviolet region. If you put all this together and ask a bunch of biologists, as we have done, what the consequences would be, the answer is that it would involve not just massive deaths of plants and animals and microorganisms all over the planet, but that it would involve massive extinctions. Now, I think it's a good idea just to go back and look at some recent calculations made in Representative Worth's neck of the woods at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. We have here a crude representation of the Earth. We can all recognize what's what. And this is the result of a computer model which has represented the Earth in 3 dimensions. The mountain ranges are present, although not apparent in this picture. And when the smoke is produced, it is then carried through the atmosphere, both around the planet in longitude and more slowly north and south in latitude. What is indicated here is the target zones of the nuclear war. And as you can see, it involves the United States, Western and Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. This shows the distribution of obscuring material 20 days after this presumed July war. This is the distribution of fine sooty smoke. And the darker it is here, the more of it there is. You can see that northern mid-latitudes have gotten an enormous amount of this stuff. The next slide shows the comparable temperature drops. The blue areas are where in July, 20 days after the war, the temperatures have dropped to somewhere between 0 degrees centigrade, the freezing point, and minus 80 degrees centigrade. The period of time that such nuclear winter effects will last is uncertain. And there are feedback effects which tend, many of them, to increase the duration, if not the intensity, of nuclear winter. It looks to us as if nuclear winter lasting many months is a rather likely possibility, and lasting many years is at least conceivable. Having said this, I would like to say something about policy implications. It seems very clear that a nuclear war could destroy our global civilization. It seems at least possible that nuclear war could destroy our species. The extinction of a species is for keeps. The extinction of human species means that we have made meaningless the lives of everybody who has ever lived. It means that we have prevented from coming into existence the lives of all those people who will one day live, if we are not so foolish as to permit nuclear war. This scale of catastrophe is the most serious that it is possible to imagine. Now, let's start with some small-scale policy implications. Civilian shelters and crisis relocation. Crisis relocation is the really wonderfully hopeful view that the citizens of the threatened cities will pour out by the millions into the nearby countryside, where they will be warmly welcomed and provided for. Civilian shelters is the equally optimistic notion that all we have to do is go into a cellar properly stocked with food and wait until the nuclear war is over. Well, we now recognize that it's going to be a long wait, and that the shelter is probably not adequately stocked, and even if it were, what are you coming out to afterwards? Another consequence, grander in its implications, of nuclear winter has to do with the planetary scale of the phenomenon. It once could be thought that if a nuclear winter happens, we could, or at least rich people could, hop on an Air New Zealand's plane and be safely out of danger. That no longer appears to be highly tenable. And the fact that the fine sooty debris races across the equator and obscures the sunlight and darkens the planet in the southern hemisphere means that we now have put the planet in jeopardy. The Secretary General of the United Nations, in a speech last December, asked, by what right do the United States and the Soviet Union have control over the life and death of every nation on the planet? Seems to me a good question. Because of the planetary scale of nuclear winter, one clear consequence is that other nations that thought they might sit this one out suddenly have a deep personal involvement in what the United States and the Soviet Union choose to do with the planet Earth. Because now, nations that are far removed from the northern mid-latitude target zone, nations, if there are any, that had no part of the quarrel between the United States and the Soviet Union, can now be utterly destroyed without a single nuclear weapon falling on their territory. Then there is an implication for Star Wars. I would not have imagined that nuclear winter could be used as justification for Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, as Mr. Reagan likes to call it, but it is. Star Wars is, as you know, a proposed scheme to build at a cost estimated variously around $1 trillion, a system which will destroy many, perhaps most, Soviet warheads in the case of a Soviet attack on the United States or a global nuclear exchange. Now, it is argued that nuclear winter means it's even more important to shoot down these warheads and prevent nuclear winter from happening. A logical consequence of that is that, of course, it is equally essential for the Soviets to have Star Wars at exactly the same pace as the United States has it, and therefore there ought to be cooperative research programs proposed by this administration to involve the Soviets at the earliest possible moment. The President came tantalizingly close to, in fact, proposing that until wiser heads prevailed. Now, even optimistic, thoughtful, sympathetic critics of the Star Wars scheme do not imagine that it will be extremely efficient at shooting down warheads. We hear numbers like 50% will be shot down, 90% will be shot down, maybe middle 90s% if you're very lucky. And bear in mind how difficult that is. We are not talking only about shooting down 10,000 Soviet warheads, all coming at the United States in the same half hour. We are talking about discriminating each of those warheads from tens or hundreds of thousands of decoys and penetration aids, which are designed to look exactly like the warheads as they come in. Let us grant that there will one day be a battle management computer which will say, no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes. Such a computer, by the way, is much too complicated to be programmed by human beings. It can only be programmed by another computer. It is also much too complicated for the program to be debugged by humans. It can only be debugged by other computers. And it, of course, can never be tested, short of a full nuclear war. And in the case of a full nuclear war, it is not controlled by humans. It's just the program and the computer and Star Wars and tens of thousands of warheads. And as I said once before, and I'm happy to say again, you have to be really Looney Tunes to bet the human species on this one. Now, suppose we have a system that's 90% efficient, shoots down 90% of the Soviet warheads. How many Soviet warheads? 10,000. 10% get through. How much is 10% of 10,000? It's 1,000 warheads. 1,000 warheads can utterly annihilate the United States. In fact, 100 warheads could utterly annihilate the United States. So what are we talking about? It doesn't buy us security. And if we're concerned about nuclear winter, as some people use nuclear winter to argue for Star Wars, let us remember that the destruction of 100 cities seems to be sufficient to produce a global nuclear winter. even optimistic assessments of how good Star Wars might be after you spend $1 trillion decades in the future imply that the United States will be destroyed and that possibly nuclear winter will be triggered. In addition, there is a nuclear winter relevant Soviet response. If they were to believe that the United States was going ahead with Star Wars, and if they were to believe that the United States had a chance of actually building it, they would be foolish to believe it, but they've done foolish things before. Their best bet is to simply build more offensive missiles. If they wish to inflict a certain level of damage on the United States, and they believe we can shoot down half their warheads, the simplest and cheapest response that they can provide is to double the number of offensive warheads. But increasing the number of warheads is exactly what you don't want to do if you're worried about nuclear winter. Now, let me come to one more policy implication of nuclear winter, and that has to do with first strike. Let us consider two nations. Here's one of them called A, and the other is called B. Administration spokesmen don't like it when I talk about A and B. They say you should be saying the good guys and the bad guys. But I don't know which way I'm standing, so it's hard to tell. A and B. Suppose, for whatever reason, A wishes to launch a disabling first strike against B. That is, to destroy B's ability to retaliate against A. Follow that so far? So A launches an attack, and it has to be thousands of warheads. It's easy to calculate that. And let's imagine every warhead works, and B's retaliatory capability is destroyed. Never mind that they have submarines or... I mean, the idea of a first strike is daft to begin with, but it is this daftness that drives the nuclear arms race. So let us assume that it is considered a real possibility that country A will make a disabling first strike against country B. Imagine that country B, for whatever reason, does not retaliate and doesn't defend itself. They just take it. What happens? Does country A win the war? Not really, because an enormous cloud of smoke and dust rises over country B, and something like 10 days later it circulates halfway around the Earth to country A, and country A is now immersed in its own nuclear winter. A first strike, therefore, if this is true, is an elaborate and inordinately expensive way to commit national suicide. Nations that wish to commit national suicide should restrict their activities to their own borders. Now let's take a look at the calculations on this concept of a disabling first strike. Here we have, in this elegant and simple indication, a nuclear war which is visited out of the blue on the United States alone. Let's imagine that the Soviets wish to make a disabling first strike against the United States, never mind the 30 nuclear submarines that are mainly not attacked in such a first strike. What happens? As you can see, the Soviet Union is in some trouble as a result of this first strike against the United States. Again July, again 20 days after the war. You would think that the prospect of first strike is therefore considerably less likely than it was before. And since it is the fear of first strike that drives large numbers of expensive and dangerous weapon systems, a realization of what nuclear winter means might very well have a calming influence on the contending superpowers. Now, it was mentioned that Representative Worth and a number of other members of Congress have introduced legislation requiring the Department of Defense to respond as to the physical, biological, sociological, and strategic implications of nuclear winter. The Department of Defense did respond with a 17-page report, which fundamentally says that yes, nuclear winter is likely, or possible anyway, and no, it doesn't change a thing. Now, on the first strike issue, let me just quote what this report signed by Mr. Weinberger says. We cannot lower our standards for deterrence. Certainly today we cannot be confident that the Soviets would expect such effects to occur as a result of all possible Soviet attacks that we may need to deter. That is certainly true. A single Soviet warhead exploded over a U.S. city or a U.S. silo will not produce nuclear winter. Therefore, the threat of nuclear winter will not deter a single warhead. But it does deter an all-out exchange, which is the very thing we are most worried about. On the same page, it says, our strategy consciously does not target population and, in fact, has provisions for reducing civilian casualties. The next slide shows a map of some of the strategic targets in the United States. The missile silo fields in the northern plain states are here, and you can see the airplanes are strategic bomber bases, and the anchors are ports that vessels, not just nuclear submarines, but others carrying strategic weapons carry. And imagine 2 nuclear weapons on every one of these things. But it's not just these. It's subsidiary airfields, because after all, we know the war is coming. We're not going to leave our strategic bombers sitting in SAC airfields. We will distribute them to long runways all over the United States. Where are those long runways? Well, they happen to be in airports. Where are airports? Well, they by accident happen to be in cities. Where is the command and control facilities of the United States? Where is the government? We might ask that question. It is... And you can add up the number of strategic targets in the United States or the Soviet Union and see how many people will be killed, and it is huge. So the Soviet Union might very well say that they do not target U.S. cities or population centers per se, but per se don't count. If you're destroyed in a nuclear attack, the fact that you weren't targeted per se is going to be cold comfort. So this stance of moral superiority, that we're good guys because we don't target population centers per se, has been properly condemned by the Catholic bishops in their peace pastoral. Let me tell you what seems to me the only possible answer to the nuclear arms race. It is not enough to be told that the kind of war that will produce nuclear winter is unlikely, because whoever it is who's talking claims to have some knowledge of U.S. targeting strategy. Most people who claim to have that knowledge don't. Those who do not know Soviet, French, Chinese, and British targeting policy, which is different. And all of those nations apparently have the capability of triggering nuclear winter. What is essential is to make a world so that under no conceivable circumstances could nuclear winter be triggered. A world in which no concatenation of machine malfunction and misunderstood orders and communications failures and madness in high office could combine to produce nuclear winter. The idea is not to make it unlikely, the idea is to make it impossible. The way to make it impossible is to have not agreements on targeting. Who could verify an agreement on targeting? But to have so few nuclear weapons that it is extremely unlikely that nuclear winter could be triggered. How many is that? If you ask if everybody went crazy and decided to use their nuclear weapons in a way to maximize the chance of nuclear winter, how many nuclear weapons would that take? The answer seems to be some hundreds. For rough estimates, let's round off and say 1,000 nuclear weapons worldwide. Well, 1,000 nuclear weapons worldwide, mainly in the U.S. and the SU, is sufficient to deter, for the reasons I mentioned before. It provides perfectly adequate strategic deterrence. And therefore, the only safe thing to do is to reduce these obscenely bloated arsenals to levels so low that while strategic deterrence can be maintained, if that's the strategy you like, it is highly unlikely that nuclear winter could be triggered. The way to do that is to do it. It's not to add more weapon systems. The Reagan administration's published plans for adding to the number of strategic warheads that we have, by the time they leave office at the end of this decade, that increment in strategic weapons will be sufficient to destroy once again every city on the planet. Why? Why do we need so many nuclear weapons? It is madness. It is a foolishness. It's a collective delusion. And it is extremely dangerous. I maintain that major, bilateral, verifiable, and massive reductions in the strategic arsenals should be the principal goal of the United States and the Soviet Union in their relations for the coming decade. And I maintain that these massive reductions is not only an expression of fundamental patriotism, because if you care about your country, you clearly don't want it to be in this fantastically vulnerable situation. But I maintain that such divestments also represents elementary planetary hygiene. Thank you very much. Well, it's hard not to be stirred and inspired by such a response. I'm deeply grateful to you. I would be delighted to try to answer questions on these issues or anything else you'd like to ask of me. There are microphones in both aisles.
My question is how do we alter not just the thinking of what the destruction that is caused by nuclear weapons, because that is not the basis for our security. The question is, how do we change the kind of, what we need is X, which is what they have, plus one, whatever X is,
right,
in order to deter. So we can literally never end.
Absolutely. If each side's view is that it has to have more than the other, then the arms race will never end. It's absolutely clear. If you're a student of mathematics, it's two coupled linear differential equations, the solution of which is an exponential. That's very simple mathematics. But neither nation wants to buy that. There is this cult of being strong, of being secure. Well, we have to ask, what are we talking about when we say strong, when we say secure? When I was a small boy growing up in Brooklyn, we had winters then too, and it snowed. When it snowed, there was this convention of snowball fights. What you learn very quickly is that there was no such thing as too many snowballs. Because if you didn't have enough snowballs, there was that terrible moment when you were crouching down trying to pack one, and your adversary is well supplied with snowballs, was standing over you, pummeling you. And that experience, much more for boys than for girls, makes people think that an infinite number of nuclear weapons is what we need. And this is precisely an example of what Einstein was talking about when he said we must change our way of thinking. Snowballs and nuclear weapons are not the same thing. Nuclear weapons are not snowballs. It's a simple enough doctrine, but it hasn't yet gotten into the halls of power.
Hello, this is Portland calling.
Hi.
Speaking as one of 4.5 billion or so not necessarily targeted per se individuals, I was wondering what can individual citizens like me do to make this nuclear winter not happen?
What can you do? Well, one thing you can do is to understand the circumstances we're in. That's difficult, not because it's intellectually demanding. It's as easy as reading the stock market pages or the baseball scores. It's not intellectually difficult, it's emotionally difficult, because it says that we have collectively done something horrendous and that we all bear some responsibility for it, and that's difficult. You know, psychiatrists have this term denial for what people do when they're faced with some really terrible prospect and feel they can't do anything about it, so might as well not think about it since it's so painful. Well, denial, I think, is exactly what we have to fight against. This is a real danger. We have brought it upon ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, and it's up to us to undo it, and it can be undone. But the first thing we have to do is to grasp the magnitude of the mistake we humans have made. Secondly, you want to convert that knowledge to those who make policy in the United States and the Soviet Union. So there are elections coming up, there always are, and it seems to me that if you were seriously concerned on this issue, you would make sure that you understood how every candidate you're voting for stands on the nuclear war issue. And it's not enough for the politician to say that I want to reduce the arsenals. They have to be explicit. Which weapon systems do they want to get rid of? How fast do they want to get rid of them? Do they want to get rid of them faster than the rate at which we are adding nuclear weapons? So I think between educating ourselves, educating our policymakers and so-called leaders, and then voting them out of office if they do not implement such policy, is the means that a merciful providence has given to Americans to influence their future. At least I hope so. Please.
Dr. Sagan, having pointed out the fallacies in the arguments of many of the leaders in our country, and having shown the daftness of the first strike concept, it would seem to me that unilateral disarmament isn't as silly as a lot of people have said it is as an idea. Change through example. If indeed a nation eventually destroys its own self, even though no weapons have hit their own surface, do you agree that therefore unilateral disarmament is not such a way out of bounds idea?
It turns out that there are unilateral, or let's say non-negotiated activities that either nation could do which would encourage the chances of bilateral action, and that would not compromise the security of the nation doing it. Let me just give you one historical example. Cuban Missile Crisis scared the United States and the Soviet Union in a really serious way. And those guys tend not to get scared by anything, even something that normal people would worry about. Well, they got so frightened that President Kennedy decided, after sending a private emissary to Premier Khrushchev to get his likely response, to announce at a speech here in Washington at American University that the United States would now simply stop testing nuclear weapons above ground. Challenge the Soviets to respond. Then, a week later, something like that, Premier Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union was unilaterally stopping above ground nuclear testing as long as the United States followed suit. Well, that is a set of two non-negotiated unilateral actions The net result of which is that there is a de facto treaty against further explosion of nuclear weapons above ground. That is a model of what can be done. And there is a parallel kind of treaty which is absolutely the central kind of treaty to the present situation, and that is a comprehensive test ban treaty, something that prevents the further underground testing of nuclear weapons, because it is that further testing which constantly drives the new technological innovations of the arms race. There is no problem, if you don't do any more testing, of keeping your nuclear arsenal safe and functional. And therefore, that's something that might be done. Having said all that, let me say, I don't see any reason for unilateral initiatives. The Soviet Union has already indicated its interest in treaties on a large number of issues, which would be clearly to the benefit of everybody on the planet.
Did the bombs at Hiroshima and at Nagasaki indicate a nuclear winter, and if they didn't, why didn't they?
Right. A single nuclear weapon, as I alluded to before, produces some smoke, of course. But when it is spread out, it is not nearly enough, not by orders of magnitude, to produce nuclear winter. Our calculations suggest that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, plus all the firestorms in World War II, should not have produced nuclear winter, nor did they, because they were too spread out in time. And there were too few of them. But if you have 100 or more cities, downtowns, burning at once, then you are somewhere near the threshold of triggering nuclear winter, we believe. That's the reason.
For more information on nuclear winter, write NRDC, Box 25,000, Washington, D.C. 20007.